Let it never be said that science is infallible, for our interpretation of data has been, and always will be, subject due to our own biases. Beliefs about how the world works or should work often influence scientists to interpret their data in ways that support their own beliefs, and to ignore alternate interpretations. After all, the scientists who perform the research are human too, and thus subject to the influence of the cultures they are from. Some research is easier to divorce from these influences than others. For example, natural science, such as physics or math. Others, like anthropology or archaeology, have been made victim to many mistakes due to using a modern viewpoint to interpret past findings.
Hello and welcome to Biological Essentialism is a Scam, and we should not be using our imperfect understanding of early humans to influence our modern understanding of gender roles. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it is our modern gender roles that influence our understanding of early humans. Today's example of this is that we are increasingly discovering that the men are hunters and women are gatherers idea is a total myth. And here is a study that you can look up on NPR. The view that men are hunters and women are gatherers has been used to make the case that men and women today should stick to these supposedly natural roles. Evidence that early women were also hunting has been there all along, but of course we refuse to see that when it doesn't fit our patriarchal narrative. What did we find? We found that women had their own toolkits. They had their favorite weapons. Grandmas were the best hunters of the village. Yes, our little grandmas. The majority of cultures for whom hunting is important train their girls and their women to make their tools and go hunting. It's always been obvious to me that early humans did not organize their society by gender in the way that we assume, because it makes no sense for efficiency and survival and food security. Instead, it's more likely that we're seeing what's going on in this page here, which is that we have these preconceived patriarchal ideas based on modern patriarchy, that men are more violent because they're a hunter, when in reality we use the idea that they're naturally hunters to excuse their violence. And you'll see down here, this important part right at the bottom, by the same token, this idea that somehow women are naturally preordained to be caretakers and maternal figures, whether they like it or not, often underlies policies that enforce that. Isn't it convenient for patriarchy to perpetuate the idea that women are in a position of service to men, and that men get to be violent, destructive, proactive, and go out there and take on the world? This is why I always say be so careful about biological essentialism when it comes to gender roles. We don't even know that early humans cared about gender or assigned gender enough to then also assign roles and tasks based on that. And we certainly shouldn't be using that to dictate gendered behavior today.
The most commonly noticed mistake is the sexing of female skeletons as male based on the items that they were buried with. If a woman is buried with weapons or had a warrior's burial, then people tend to assume it is a man's remains, even without DNA testing or while ignoring other obvious aspects such as hip size and shape. The field of psychology is no different. I graduated with a bachelor's in psychology earlier this year, and I admit I'm one of those weird ones who genuinely enjoys reading psychology studies and pointing out their flaws or implications for the average person. Hence this channel, where I have multiple times referenced psych studies in quite a few videos. However, if I'm talking to a person who has actual hobbies, when they hear psychology, the first thing they tend to think of is Sigmund Freud, or one of those pseudo-scientific wives' tales often passed off as psychology. Freud's work remains largely unfalsifiable or has long since been disproven, and yet he retains an undeniable influence on the field as a whole. Ideas like the Oedipus/Electra complex or hysteria have been used to control, delegitimize, and support institutions of harm against women. Let's start with the Oedipus/Electra complex. Oedipus refers to Oedipus Rex, a Greek tragedy attributed to Sophocles, wherein Oedipus is prophesied to kill his father and marry his mother. It is a story about the fight of free will versus fate, and despite Oedipus not wanting to marry his mother, and indeed being unaware of her identity, Freud used his name for his theory that children were attracted to their opposite-sex parent and had sexual fantasies about them, which were only suppressed due to a fear of the wrath of their same-sex parent. This theory hinges on a sexualization of children and a belief that humans are sexual beings from birth, in the sense that highly pleasurable sensual experiences such as caressing, cuddling, and kissing are essential for normal development in infancy. Freud also believed that preschool children were naturally curious about sexuality, including the question of where babies come from.
What really is the Oedipus complex? In the last video, we talked about how the word complex is generally associated with Carl Jung. However, Freud also used the term, but in a very different way. And when it comes to the Oedipus complex, he said it was the nuclear complex, the central complex of human experience. Oedipus Rex is a Greek tragedy written by Sophocles and tells the story of Oedipus, who tries to avoid a prophecy that he will marry his mother and kill his father, and in the end does just that, marries his mother and kills his father. After he finds out, he blinds himself and his mother hangs herself. They don't call it a tragedy for nothing. Freud's theory is based on the idea that in everybody's unconscious, we fall in love with our mother and we see our father as a threat to that love and fantasize murdering our fathers so that we can be with our mothers. It's no wonder that this idea makes people pretty uncomfortable. What makes most people uncomfortable about this theory is the sexual element and the element of incest, that somebody in their unconscious would want to have sex with their mother and actually commit patricide. And though Freud was quite literal about this, these days we take the Oedipus complex as a metaphor, and that is it stands for any triangular relationship, and we see it as a form of attachment. You make an attachment to one individual, and then there is a fear of competition from a third individual. Developmentally, we see an exclusive attachment to the primary caregiver, which is generally the mother, and then any third person is seen as a threat to that in the unconscious of the child's mind, producing an envy and possibly an aggression. So that we no longer see the Oedipus complex as a sexual desire and a murderous desire, we do see it as a desire for exclusive attachment to one person and fear of competition from the other.
The case study used to justify this theory was little Hans, a boy with an intense fear of horses. As noted in Is the Oedipus Complex Real?, Freud argued that Herbert's anxieties all stemmed from his foundational animosity towards his father. For example, Freud claimed that Herbert's phobia of horses represented a variation of castration anxiety, the fear that a horse, resembling his father, would punish him for desiring his mother by castrating him. Freud interpreted the giraffe dream as a reinvention of a fantasized relationship between Herbert and his parents. Herbert desires to be with the crumpled giraffe, representing his mother, while his father, manifested in the healthy giraffe, calls out from a distance. Freud's methods of psychoanalytic therapy seem odd and unscientific from today's perspective. There was little empirical proof to support any of his claims during his time. Today, there are some studies which illustrate that parents do have a significant impact on their children's sexual tendencies. A 1986 study showed that male rats are sexually attracted to females with scents that remind them of their mothers. And a 2010 report suggests that people are more attracted to others who look like them and are also more inclined to find others more attractive after seeing a picture of their opposite sex parent. However, the assertion that all children go through a period of sexual attraction to their opposite sex parent is a stretch. This also doesn't account for homosexuality and bisexuality, nor does it consider the influence of different cultures. For example, sex may be normalized and demystified for children growing up in farms or in cultures with communal bedroom spaces, and therefore the traumatic incident of seeing your parents have sex may not be traumatic or impactful at all, erasing the potential damage he speculated would occur as a result of the Oedipus complex and seeing your parents getting to it. It's also important to note that his treatment of little Hans was unsuccessful, as reported by the patient himself years later. Of course, his treatment neglected to note that Hans spent a lot of time in an area with horses where he was warned that horses could bite and could have conceivably been bitten. Additionally, he is very much a man of his time, as his Electra complex, meant to be the female version of the Oedipus complex, illustrates. I want to note that Carl Jung named it, but Freud is the one who first developed the idea. Even though he didn't really like the naming it Electra complex, it still stands. His theory is that children go through psychosexual stages, with the most important being the phallic stage from ages 3 to 6, where boys focus on their penis and girls on their lack of penis. As noted on Healthline, in a girl's psychosexual development, Freud proposed she's first attracted to her mother until she realizes she doesn't have a penis. This causes her to resent her mother for castrating her, a situation Freud referred to as penis envy. Because of this, she develops an attachment to her father. Later, the girl identifies more strongly with her mother and emulates her behavior out of fear of losing her mother's love. Freud called this a feminine Oedipus attitude. Freud believed this was a crucial stage in a young girl's development, as it leads her to accept gender roles and accept her own sexuality.
Female hysteria. What was it really? By modern definition, hysteria means exaggerated or uncontrollable emotion or excitement and comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. How did uterus and craziness become so closely associated that they essentially share a name? In the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, Hippocrates believed that the uterus could move freely throughout the abdomen. This was known as the wandering womb, in which a misplaced womb could cause myriad symptoms, and even Plato contributed to this theory. It later came to be known as hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for symptoms such as anxiety, insomnia, irritability, just pain, too much or too little desire for sex, general troublemaking, and more. The idea of female hysteria persisted in some form for around 4,000 years until the term was fully removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980. It persisted despite huge changes in theories about what caused it and how to treat it. One of the earlier treatments was scent therapy. Pleasant smells would be placed in a woman's cave of wonders and foul smells in her mouth to try to attract the uterus to its correct position, away from the bad smells and towards the good ones. And later, hysterectomies, hypnosis, and even insane asylums. In short, it's all bad.
Freud proposed that the feminine Oedipus attitude was more emotionally intense than the Oedipus complex, so it was repressed more harshly by the young girl. This, he believed, led to women being less self-confident and more subservient. The concept of penis envy ignores that boys were given much more freedom, autonomy, and generally treated as human, while girls were, from birth, only truly given the option of passing from her father's object to her husband's. Freud, as many philosophers, scientists, and men in general believed, thought that women were incomplete males. Feminist theorists have long noted this tradition and its influence on women's place in society, science, and medicine. As Simone de Beauvoir wrote in The Second Sex, "The female is female by virtue of a certain lack of qualities," Aristotle said. "We should regard woman's nature as suffering from natural defectiveness." And St. Thomas in his turn decreed that woman was an incomplete man, an incidental being. This is what the Genesis story symbolizes, where Eve appears as if drawn from Adam's supernumerary bone. In Bossett's words, "Humanity is male, and man defines woman, not in herself, but in relation to himself. She is not considered an autonomous being." Monsieur Benda declares in Uriel's report, "Man thinks himself without woman, woman does not think herself without man. And she is nothing other than what man decides. She is thus called the sex. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other." Freud viewed women as being dominated by their reproduction and staunchly opposed feminism and the women's rights movement. He even wrote, in 1925's The Psychical Consequences of the Anatomic Distinction Between the Sexes, that women oppose change, receive passively, and add nothing of their own. To Freud, women were simply men without penises. So naturally, he introduced a stage of penis envy, where a woman realizes she does not possess a penis and experiences an envy of the male, which accounted for much of female behavior. Freud claimed that the only way they could overcome this penis envy was to have a child of their own, even going as far as to suggest they wanted a male child in their efforts to gain a penis. A female contemporary psychologist, Karen Horney, argued that the concept of penis envy was flawed, as deviation from femininity and gender roles was merely an example of women strafing against societal constraints of their gender. In other words, a resistance against the existence of misogyny. Horney proposed an oppositional belief that womb envy arises when men realize that they are not as in control and powerful in their lives as they had originally thought they were. Geraghty Spivak also addresses womb envy and how Freud ignored the capabilities of a woman. The term womb envy also extends to describe the envy men can feel because they are unable to perform the same biological functions as women are, such as pregnancy, giving birth, and breastfeeding.
Today's STEM Women Wednesday is about psychoanalyst Karen Horney. Yes, who's aptly named because she argued against the father of psychoanalytic theory, Sigmund Freud, who posited that young girls experience anxiety when they realize they don't have a penis. So basically all women have penis envy. No, you all can keep that. She was born in Germany in 1885 and got inspired to study psychology after battling her own depression. She was well versed in Freudian theory and began treating her own patients. She also began officially teaching at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute in 1920. This boss argued that society didn't allow women to have power and instead forced them to live through their husbands and children. So basically, women didn't have penis envy. They didn't want to be men. They just wanted the freedom that men had. Amen to that. Karen moved to America in 1932, where she developed a new theory of neurosis, and she realized that anxiety wasn't just caused by biology, but also the environment in which you grow up. Of course, she received a lot of backlash, but eventually she founded the Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis. Thank you for giving us a voice, Queen.
These beliefs regarding women are further reflected in hysteria, a diagnosis which builds upon the misogyny of wandering womb, an example of misogynistic pseudoscience from antiquity. The idea that women's ailments stem from the uterus wandering within the body due to a lack of pregnancy goes back to the Greeks. A translation by Francis Adams states, "In the middle of the flanks of women lies the womb, a female viscus, closely resembling an animal, for it is moved of itself hither and thither in the flanks, also upwards in a direct line to below the cartilage of the thorax, and also obliquely to the right or to the left, either to the liver or the spleen, and it likewise is subject to prolapsus downwards, and, in a word, it is altogether erratic. It delights also in fragrant smells and advances towards them, and it has an aversion to fetid smells and flees from them, and on the whole the womb is like an animal within an animal." Hysteria served as a diagnosis for any and all ailments a woman might have, tied to the fact that she was female and had a uterus. Just as wandering womb and previous female-only diseases were treated, Freud offered the solution of marriage and, unsaid, regular intercourse. Often, hysteria was tied to sexual abuse, which Freud, at the start of his career, determined that there was an enormous body of evidence, personal, clinical, and legal, which demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that huge numbers of children were being abused, most often by their fathers, which included many of his friends and contemporaries, and eventually led to a retraction, followed by justification mired in victim blaming.
Early in his career, Sigmund Freud had a number of women come into his office suffering from hysteria. And hysteria was a word rooted in the Greek for uterus. It was a condition specifically for women who had inability to focus. They couldn't sleep. They were restless. They struggled with fear and anxiety. Now, of course, this was PTSD, which wouldn't be named for another 50 plus years. But as he did more research into each of these cases, what he uncovered is that the vast majority of these women experienced sexual abuse during their childhood. They were sexually assaulted. They were victims of incest by their fathers and siblings. Now, in 1896, he published The Theory of Seduction, stating that hysteria was caused by childhood sexual abuse. There was so much backlash about this exposure of this crime. First of all, a lot of the people that were bringing these women in to be treated were the very perpetrators of their abuse. These people were wealthy, they were well connected. His peers were also connected to a lot of these people, and they really didn't want it being exposed that society had a problem of this magnitude and this degree. After a lot of time, about 9 years or so, he retracted his theory. He worked to destroy all the evidence, and he worked to suppress anyone who was coming out to support this theory. The new theory, trigger warning, was that children starting as young as the age of 4 would have sexual fantasies about sexual interactions with their parents and other people. That children somehow manifested these dreams or, the suppression of these feelings, and that's what was causing all of this, which of course was ridiculous. But it would take almost 100 years for society to come around again and understand that this is a serious problem. In the 1980s, we saw a lot of the work beginning, but it really wasn't until the 1990s when the ACE study revealed that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men conservatively are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And all this goes to show us how far our society will go to cover up these crimes. Whether it's Freud, the Catholic Church, Boy Scouts, USA Gymnastics, every community has a cover-up. Every family has a cover-up. Every institution has a cover-up. There's no real safe places unless they are prioritizing the safety of children and addressing this issue with trainings, protocol, awareness, education of children, and taking steps to reduce risk. Silence does not protect children. It enables abuse. And we have to get over the discomfort in order to protect children. Our discomfort is nothing compared to what these children have experienced.
He expressed a view that the traumatic memories, which he was constantly hearing, were only the fabrication of the mind, grounded on frustrated Oedipal desires. In effect, he said that the revelations of sexual abuse had no foundation in reality, but were expressions of the patient's repressed sexual desires. This created a long-lasting legacy of denial of sexual abuse and, if admitted to, its impact, which lasted long after Freud had passed and many of his theories were disproven. Hysteria was removed from the DSM-3 in 1980. The legacy of hysteria, victim blaming, and sex-specific ailments continues to this day in borderline personality disorder, or BPD. Before BPD was hysterical personality disorder, which was depicted in the DSM-2, published in 1968, as essentially a caricature of exaggerated femininity, as the symptoms included excitability, emotional instability, overreactivity, and self-dramatization. Indeed, the description in DSM-2 of hysterics as attention-seeking, seductive, immature, self-centered, vain, and dependent on others is almost identical to the 19th century description of hysteria. In the DSM-3, published in 1980, hysterical personality disorder was renamed histrionic personality disorder to avoid the negative connotations that were associated with hysteria. However, the descriptors of the typical patient outlined in the DSM-3 still depict an exaggerated femininity. Someone who is typically attractive and seductive, overly concerned with physical attractiveness, as well as interested in controlling the opposite sex or entering into a dependent relationship, and continually demanding reassurance, approval, or praise. Isn't this how we are taught to do girl through teenage magazines, romantic fiction, and chick flicks? While the turn of the century led to gains in feminism and women's rights and the disavowal of an overt feminine mental disorder, borderline personality disorder simply took the place of hysteria, capturing contemporary values about the behavior of women. Borderline personality disorder is described as a feminized psychiatric diagnosis because it is applied more often to women than men, at a rate of 3-to-1 to as high as 7-to-1. The criteria for diagnosis consists of symptoms that characterize feminine qualities. These include depression and emotional liability, as well as impulsiveness in areas such as shoplifting, substance abuse, sex, reckless driving, and binge eating, and identity disturbance, evidenced by uncertainty about self-image, sexual orientation, long-term goals, or career choice. However, where borderline personality disorder differs from hysteria, or histrionic personality disorder, is the inclusion of the more masculine characteristic of inappropriate, intense anger as a criterion for diagnosis. So, whilst both diagnostic categories adopt gender stereotypes in positioning particular women as mad, Jimin's comments, if the hysteric was a damaged woman, the borderline woman is a dangerous one. In other words, women's anger and emotional distress is pathologized, while men's emotional distress and anger is often attributed to a bad day or other daily experiences. BPD is often diagnosed in child abuse survivors and details the result of abuse. In other words, it often serves to pathologize not just behaviors in women which are deemed negative, but trauma as well.
Lots of people don't know how closely related borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and emotionally unstable personality disorder, the terms, the so-called diagnostic criteria, and the concept that underpins them, how close that is to hysteria, and how they're all connected. And for me, when I learnt that years ago, it changed the way I looked at everything. I was already very skeptical about those diagnoses because I saw them all the time when I was managing rape centres and women's services and things like that. It really made me think, why is like almost every woman and girl on our caseload got a personality disorder? Why is it all the same one? You know, that doesn't sound right to me. But, you know, when I learned about the history of it and where they come from, it really did, it was game changing for me, because it all slotted into place, and I started to realise that it was misogyny. And, you know, hysteria, the word you hear, it's like mass hysteria, or we laughed hysterically, or she's hysterical. It means female insanity. It's the belief that females are born insane, that we're all mental, and that we are mentally ill because of our uterus. And it was called Wandering Womb Syndrome, which is the name of our Wandering Womb podcast. It's a play on that, you know, like crazy women talking about things. But anyway, it's this belief from centuries ago that still prevailed in like the late 70s and the early 80s, that the uterus would detach from all the other organs in the body and float around a female body and like attack your brain and attack your lung and your heart and make you crazy. And so, you know, the so-called cures to hysteria were misogynistic and oppressive. They were forcing you to have sex with men, forcing you to get pregnant and have a baby, to submit to men, having full hysterectomies, sterilizing you. And that's something that we need to talk about, the history of this stuff.
Rivka Wolf, diagnosed with BPD, notes that personality disorders, particularly BPD and narcissism, do an excellent job of describing how childhood trauma works. They define the impacts of significant child abandonment and abuse and the wounds that are left behind in the wake of this pain. I don't know about you, but that does not really sound like a mental illness to me. What it sounds like is trauma. It sounds like the description of pain. The most common disorder for traumatized women is to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. This extremely stigmatized disorder is commonly associated with Hollywood portrayals of crazy women. From Fatal Attraction's Alex to single white females Heidi, we all know what a woman with BPD looks like, don't we? She looks like Amber Heard, following Johnny Depp around the room while he tries to escape from her, lying about being raped for no reason. She is Evan Rachel Wood, insisting Marilyn Manson held her hostage in his home and ritually abused her. An obvious fabrication. She is your sister, daughter, mother, girlfriend, calling you an abuser because she inexplicably hates men. In other words, BPD is everything about women you love to hate. Funny story. These women are telling the truth. Child abuse and exploitation sets people up to be victimized later on. These women are treated as though having prior PTSD and experiences of childhood abuse means they are not worth listening to now. Yet what we know is that statistically, experiencing child abuse makes it more likely that you will be abused later on. What we know too is that survivors are not at fault for our abuse. That is the fault of our abusers. Why do we blame these women for the harm that has been done to them, just because they were once hurt? Treating BPD as a personality disorder rather than what it really is, a complex and particularly damaging form of BPD, has many effects. As a long list of feminist articles and books point out, the BPD diagnosis is primarily used to stigmatize female survivors of child sexual abuse to make sure survivors of severe interpersonal violence will not be listened to. The diagnostic criteria of someone who lacks a stable sense of identity is addicted to substances and struggles with sexual boundaries. Welcome to the inevitable reality of growing up with abusive caregivers. As Jessica Taylor points out in her book, Sexy But Psycho, women and teenage girls are shepherded into psychiatric care by communities that refuse to deal with our experiences of violence and trauma head-on. Psychiatrists then diagnose PTSD, for which there are a handful of established, extremely expensive so-so treatments that don't do much for chronic child abuse. Diagnosing BPD rather than complex PTSD means redirecting treatment away from healing the trauma. The use of psychology to justify self-serving acts, namely the subjugation of a class of people, is not just restricted to women.
Do you know that the desire to escape slavery was labelled as a mental illness in 1851? Hypotonia was diagnosed to any black person who desired to escape bondage. Don't you think this leads to the distrust black people have in mental health services?
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
In 1851, this doctor, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, invented the disease drapetomania. The disease was activated when an enslaved black person had the urge to seek freedom or run away from bondage. Cartwright said the treatment was severe whipping or amputation of toes. Cartwright also said that black people have lower lung functioning, a false belief that still exists today in medicine.
Samuel Cartwright hypothesized in 1851 that the reason why slaves attempted to escape captivity in the American South was due to drapetomania. This centered on a belief somewhat related to the white man's burden, wherein there was a belief that slavery was such an improvement upon the lives of slaves that only those suffering from some form of mental illness would wish to escape. In his own words, drapetomania is from draptese. A runaway slave is mania, mad, or crazy. It is unknown to our medical authorities, although its diagnostic symptoms be absconding from service. It is well known to our planters and overseers. In noticing a disease that, therefore, is hitherto classed among the long list of maladies that man is subject to, it was necessary to have a new term to express it. The cause in most cases that induces the Negro to run away from service is as much a disease of the mind as any other species of mental alienation, and much more curable as a general rule. With the advantages of proper medical advice strictly followed, this troublesome practice that many Negroes have of running away can be almost entirely prevented, although the slaves are located on the borders of a free state within a stone's throw of abolitionists. The solution to such a disease: beating the patient or amputating their toes. Cartwright also determined another disorder specific to black slaves. Dysethia Ethiopica. This so-called disease, manifested by partial insensitivity of the skin and so great a hebitude of the intellectual faculties as to be like a person half asleep, appeared also with lesions. Overseers called it rascality, and it can be summed up as a lack of work ethic. The treatment: whipping and hard labor. Homophobia and harm to gay people have also been justified due to institutional homophobia within the field of psychology. 1952's first edition of the DSM listed sexual deviation under sociopathic personality disturbance, alongside transvestism, pedophilia, fetishism, and sexual sadism, including rape, sexual assault, mutilation. While removed from the DSM in 1973, after a panel which determined that to be considered a psychiatric disorder, it must either regularly cause subjective distress or be regularly associated with some generalized impairment in social effectiveness or functioning, the impact of homosexuality being viewed as a medical diagnosis remained. Indeed, homosexuality was changed to sexual orientation disturbance, referring not to the act of homosexuality, but the distress that came along with it. The original intent of adding it to the DSM was to remove it from the grasp of religion and into the realm of science. But if you are a minority, it may seem obvious that distress occurs not because there is something wrong with you, but because you are reacting to how others treat you. In other words, if you are enslaved, then you would obviously be unhappy with your circumstances and seek to leave them. If you are a woman in a society which prevents you from having autonomy, you would be unhappy with that. The same goes for homosexuality or gender nonconformity. This concept is detailed in the minority stress model, which is defined as the high levels of stress faced by members of a stigmatized minority groups. It may be caused by a number of factors, including poor social support and low socioeconomic status. Well-understood causes of minority stress are interpersonal prejudice and discrimination. While it offers a method of acknowledging the result of discrimination without pathologizing it, this framework has also been used to funnel homosexuals, along with teens who are facing misogyny, into gender transition. In other words, the field of psychology is pathologizing societal problems and placing the problem on the shoulders of the victims instead of the perpetrators. It is often believed that the frequently co-occurring psychiatric symptoms of gender dysphoric individuals are a result of prejudice and discrimination brought about by gender nonconformity, and that gender transition will ameliorate these symptoms. Under this model, all roads lead to Rome, and all problems an individual may have can be attributed as being a part of their gender dysphoria. Ergo, treating gender dysphoria is seen as a way to successfully treat not only depression and anxiety, but to also resolve neurocognitive deficits frequently present in gender dysphoric individuals. In doing so, attempts to treat gender dysphoria have become another form of conversion therapy. One study found that most children of gender dysphoria will not remain gender dysphoric after puberty. Children of persistent GID are characterized by more extreme gender dysphoria in childhood than children with assisting gender dysphoria. With regard to sexual orientation, the most likely outcome of childhood GID is homosexuality or bisexuality. Other studies have found that if left untreated, gender dysphoria tends to simply go away, and that many of those who have it are homosexual or bisexual. There is currently an about-face underway regarding psychology's stance on gender dysphoria, but much of the medical field has supported the rise of medicalization of what can easily be seen as a result of an increasingly misogynistic environment and a generally intolerant world regarding gender nonconformity. The long history of psychology's failures regarding minorities should be remembered regarding advancements in the field that seem biased or inaccurate. After all, those within the field are just as human as the rest of us and carry their biases into their work. Sometimes these can be accounted for and acknowledged, but often they slip through the fingers of journals, editors, and the websites who eagerly dumb down their work for a broader audience. This, dear viewers, is where we part. This is a topic that I obviously am very interested about because I actually do read psychology studies and papers for fun. I think they're really, really interesting. And that's the reason why I decided to get into psychology way back in high school. That I thought the idea of getting to understand these issues to a greater degree was just such an interesting concept. And what I've learned, especially through college, is that, quite simply, there's a lot of wrong out there. I mean, some studies you don't want to believe because they go against what you've been taught, which you personally believe. It goes against your worldview. But you can often find that, the numbers show that the methodology shows that maybe you are in the wrong. And that's why I think it's important to have an open mind. But often this bias persists even within the field, where if you have a researcher who is really interested in the trans topic and think they know best, they might run the study in a way that is biased, but they won't admit to it. And so other people will call it out, or maybe they won't. A lot of fields of science, psychology, academia at the moment refuse to call out these issues out of a fear of hurting people's feelings, of going against the current, way things are. And that's what I really got interested in, was that, looking back, psychology's made so many mistakes. And if we can admit, yeah, hey, drapetomania is stupid, obviously slaves want to be free, then we should also be able to look at some of the studies today and say, hey, that methodology looks stupid, I don't think this is accurate. And this is one of the reasons why I really, really think that you guys, if you are at all interested in these topics, read the studies yourself. Don't just take the word of an article at its value. Read the words of the study itself. If you have the ability to critically think, you have the ability to read through these things even without a degree in psychology and think, does this sound accurate? Are they studying things correctly? And more often than not, a lot of these papers, a lot of these studies that are supporting what gender dysphoria is or how it should be treated, they're just inaccurate and wrong, and it's blatantly obvious if you sit down and look for it. If you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns, let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.